When narcissists know they're guilty, and I want to start with the word know, because it is the most psychologically loaded word in this title, and the one that most people hearing this topic for the first time will instinctively push back on. Do narcissists actually know they're guilty? Do they have access to a genuine, internally registered sense of having done something wrong, that the rest of their behavior is organized around managing? Or is the guilt the wrong frame entirely? Is what looks like guilt management actually something else? Something that does not require the conscious experience of having done wrong, but that produces the same behavioral signature from a completely different psychological origin? This question matters more than it might initially appear to, because the answer determines everything about how you read the behaviors we are about to discuss. If the narcissist knows they are guilty in the way a person with a fully developed conscience knows they are guilty, with the internal registration of having caused harm, the accompanying impulse toward repair, the genuine discomfort of having acted in ways that contradict a self-concept organized around being a good person, then the behaviors that follow the guilt might be genuinely motivated by some version of remorse, however distorted, however self-servingly expressed. If what looks like guilt knowledge is actually something different, if what the narcissist is responding to is not the internal experience of having done wrong, but the external threat of being seen as having done wrong, the specific danger of exposure, rather than the genuine weight of accountability, then the behaviors that follow it are not motivated by remorse at all. They are motivated by threat management. And threat management and remorse, however similar their behavioral expressions can sometimes appear, are completely different in their implications for what comes next, and for what the person on the receiving end of them should understand about the situation they are in. By the end of this episode, you are going to be able to tell the difference, not just intellectually, in the specific, lived, this is actually happening right now way that makes the difference between being manipulated by a behavior you cannot read and being completely unaffected by a behavior you can read so clearly it has lost all of its operational power over you. Let's establish the psychological foundation first, because without it, the specific behaviors we are about to discuss look like random variations of difficult human behavior, rather than the coherent, predictable, internally logical responses to a specific internal state that they actually are. The narcissist relationship with guilt is one of the most specifically and consistently misunderstood aspects of narcissistic psychology, and the misunderstanding runs in both directions. On one side is the position that narcissists feel no guilt whatsoever, that the absence of empathy that characterizes narcissistic personality structure means the absence of any internal registration of having caused harm, and that therefore what looks like guilt management in a narcissist is purely performative, a social gesture, rather than an internal experience. On the other side is the position that narcissists feel guilt exactly as other people feel it, but suppress it with such efficiency that it only appears in behavioral form rather than in the acknowledged, verbally expressed form that most people associate with genuine remorse. Neither of these positions is entirely accurate, and the truth that sits between them is considerably more useful for understanding what is actually happening when the narcissist does what they always do when they know they are guilty. What is actually happening is this. The narcissist does register, at some level, the gap between their behavior and the social and moral standards that they intellectually understand apply to the situation. This registration is not nothing. It is not the complete absence of internal experience that the no-guilt position suggests. But it is also not guilt in the full sense that a person with a healthy conscience experiences guilt. It is not the felt sense of having caused harm to another person, organized around genuine care for the person harmed, producing an impulse toward repair that is motivated by that care. What it is more accurately described as is threat detection. The narcissist system registers the gap between their behavior and the applicable standards not as I hurt someone, and that matters because they matter, but as I have done something that, if known, could produce negative consequences for how I am perceived and therefore for my access to the supply and the status and the control that my self-image requires. The registration is real. The discomfort it produces is real. The urgency it generates is real, but the urgency is organized around the threat to the self-image rather than around the harm to the other person. And that distinction between guilt organized around the harm caused and threat detection organized around the self-image threatened is the key to understanding every behavior that follows when the narcissist knows they are guilty. The behaviors are not the expressions of remorse working its way toward repair. They are the expressions of a threat management system working its way toward containment. And containment, not repair, is what every single behavior on this list is ultimately designed to produce. The first behavior, and I want to be specific about these, because specificity is what makes them recognizable in real time rather than only in retrospect. The first behavior is the preemptive strike. And this one catches people most off guard, because it arrives before the guilt has been named, before the conversation about what happened has occurred, before the person who was harmed has had the opportunity to articulate what the harm was. The preemptive strike is the narcissist getting there first. Not to the conversation about the harm. They will avoid that conversation with every tool available to them for as long as possible. They get there first in a different sense. They get there first in the narrative. The preemptive strike is the sudden emergence, in the period immediately following the behavior the narcissist knows was wrong, of a version, of events or a characterization of the relationship, or a specific complaint about the person they harmed that serves to preoccupy the available conversational and emotional space with something other than the harm that was done. They become, suddenly and with a specificity that is telling, the aggrieved party. Something you did, some quality you have, some pattern in your behavior that they have apparently been tolerating with quiet patience becomes, in the period immediately after the thing they know they did, an urgent issue requiring immediate address. The timing is not coincidental. The urgency is not spontaneous. The preemptive strike is the threat management system doing exactly what threat management systems do when the threat has not yet fully materialized, moving to shape the territory before the threat arrives, so that when the conversation about accountability finally becomes unavoidable, the terrain has already been arranged to make the narcissist's position more defensible. You are the one with the problem. You are the one whose behavior requires examination. The thing they did is not the subject of the moment. You are, and the specific, disorienting effectiveness of this maneuver is that it activates your own self-examination, your own genuine, good-faith willingness to consider whether the thing, my being, raised is a legitimate concern, which consumes exactly the attention and the energy that would otherwise be directed at the accountability that the preemptive strike was designed to prevent. The second behavior is the one that most people who have been in significant relationships with narcissists will recognize immediately, and that most people who have not will find almost impossible to believe as a genuine, consistent pattern. The second behavior is the sudden, specifically timed performance of vulnerability. Not vulnerability that is offered as a genuine opening of the interior. The real thing looks and feels entirely different and is available to anyone with sufficient perceptive sensitivity to tell the difference. The performed vulnerability that appears when the narcissist knows they are guilty has a specific quality that distinguishes it from the genuine article, and learning to read that quality is one of the most protective skills available to someone navigating a relationship with a narcissist. The performed vulnerability arrives with perfect timing, exactly when the weight of what was done is becoming heavy enough that the person who was harmed is approaching the specific quality of clarity that produces the conversation the narcissist needs to prevent. It arrives with a specific emotional register, not the quiet, exposed, genuinely uncomfortable quality of someone making themselves genuinely vulnerable, but a dramatic, complete, fully realized emotional display that occupies all available emotional space in the interaction, and that leaves no room for the conversation about accountability that the vulnerability was timed to prevent. And it arrives with a specific content, not the acknowledgement of the thing that was done, which genuine vulnerability would produce, but the expression of a pain or a struggle or a need that makes the person who was harmed feel that raising the issue of accountability in this moment would be cruel. that the person in front of them is suffering enough without having to also be held accountable for what they did. And the empathic, caring, genuinely compassionate person who was harmed by the narcissist's behavior is particularly susceptible to this specific maneuver because their natural orientation toward someone who appears to be suffering is toward care rather than toward accountability. And the narcissist's threat management system knows this. It has known it since early in the relationship, and the performed vulnerability is precisely calibrated to activate exactly that orientation at exactly the moment when the alternative to activating it would be the conversation the narcissist needs to avoid. The third behavior, and the ones that follow it through to the most sophisticated and most difficult to detect forms that the guilty narcissist threat management produces, those are exactly where we are going next. The third behavior is the one that operates most directly on your perception of your own judgment, and it is the most insidious of the sequence, precisely because it does not feel like something being done to you. It feels like something happening inside you, a spontaneous reconsideration, a natural softening of the certainty that was building before the behavior arrived, a genuine wondering about whether your read on the situation is as accurate as it felt before this specific interaction began producing its specific effects. The third behavior is what is most accurately described as reality re-anchoring, the systematic, often subtle, always specifically directed introduction of alternative frameworks for understanding what happened that are designed not to produce accurate understanding, but to produce sufficient uncertainty about your existing understanding that the clarity required for accountability cannot fully form. Reality re-anchoring is not the same as gaslighting, though it shares gaslighting's fundamental structure. Gaslighting is the direct denial of your perception, the assertion that what you remember did not happen, that what you felt was not what you felt, that the thing you know is not what you know. Reality re-anchoring is more sophisticated than that. It does not deny your perception directly. It contextualizes it. It surrounds it with alternative explanations that are plausible enough to introduce doubt without being provably false, that are delivered with enough apparent good faith to seem like genuine attempts at mutual understanding, rather than the threat management maneuvers they attempt actually are. The narcissist who knows they are guilty does not tell you that you are wrong about what happened. They tell you that what happened is more complicated than you are currently understanding it, that your read on the situation is missing important context, that the intentions behind the behavior were not what the behavior appeared to communicate, that a fuller picture of the circumstances would produce a more charitable interpretation. All of these re-anchoring moves contain just enough that is possibly accurate. Circumstances are often complicated. Intentions do matter. Charitable interpretation is generally a quality of good relationships, that the person receiving them cannot simply dismiss them as false. They have to engage with them. They have to consider whether the re-anchoring is offering genuine insight or performing the appearance of genuine insight while actually doing something else entirely, and the considering, the good faith, genuine, intellectually honest considering that the re-anchoring is designed to produce is itself the mechanism through which the re-anchoring works, because the considering delays the clarity, and the delaying of the clarity is the function the behavior was designed to serve. What makes reality re-anchoring distinguishable from genuine contextualizing, if you know what to look for, is two things. The first is timing. Genuine contextualizing arrives early in a conversation about a difficult situation, before clarity has formed, as an attempt to ensure that the understanding that forms is complete. Reality re-anchoring arrives specifically when clarity is forming, when the accumulation of evidence has reached the threshold where the understanding is becoming uncomfortably specific, when the conversation is approaching the point where accountability would be the natural next movement. The arrival specifically at that threshold is not coincidental. It is the threat management system detecting the approach of accountability and deploying the most available tool for slowing the approach. The second distinguishing feature is directionality. Genuine contextualizing moves the understanding toward greater accuracy, even when the greater accuracy is uncomfortable for the person offering the context. Reality re-anchoring always, without exception, moves the understanding in the direction that is more comfortable for the narcissist, toward the interpretation that reduces their responsibility, that increases the ambiguity around what happened, that makes the clarity you were approaching feel less certain than it did before the re-anchoring arrived. If the context being offered is consistently moving in the direction that is most convenient for the person offering it, the context is not genuine. It is management. And recognizing it as management, in the moment when it is arriving with all of the social markers of genuine good faith, is one of the most sophisticated perceptive skills available to someone navigating a relationship with a narcissist. But it is available, and once it is developed, the reality re-anchoring loses most of its operational power, because its power depends entirely on being received as something other than what it is. The fourth behavior in the sequence is the one that most directly serves the narcissist's long-term threat management strategy, rather than the immediate management of the specific situation that triggered the guilt. It is the strategic restructuring of the social environment around the event, the specific, targeted work of shaping how the people in the shared social world understand what happened, before the person who was harmed has the opportunity to share their experience of what happened with those people in their own words. This behavior goes by the name smear campaign in the language that has developed around narcissistic abuse, but that term does not fully capture what is happening in the cases where it is most sophisticated, because smear campaign implies something that looks obviously like an attack, something that the people on the receiving end of it can readily identify as a targeted negative characterization. The sophisticated version of this behavior does not always look like an attack. It often looks like concern. The narcissist who is managing the social environment in the aftermath of something they know was wrong does not always approach mutual contacts with explicit negative characterizations of the person they harmed. They approach them with a specific quality of worried, reluctant, apparently conflicted, sharing that positions the information being shared as something the narcissist is almost hesitant to say, but feels responsible to mention, out of genuine care for the person they are talking to. The information itself, carefully selected, specifically framed, strategically incomplete, is delivered in a register that makes it almost impossible for the recipient to receive it as an attack, rather than as a sincere, if painful, communication from someone who is genuinely troubled by what they feel they need to share. And the effect of this carefully delivered information on the social environment is not the dramatic, obvious shift that a clear attack would produce. It is a subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of the available sympathy, a slight adjustment in the perspective through which the shared social world will receive whatever the harmed person eventually shares, a preloading of the interpretive framework that will be applied to the harmed person's account of events when that account finally arrives. The narcissist is not trying to win an argument. They are trying to ensure that the argument, when it occurs, takes place on terrain they have already prepared. This is the fourth behavior, and like the others, its effectiveness depends entirely on not being recognized for what it is. And recognizing it requires the specific, clear-eyed attention to the timing and the directionality that distinguishes threat management from the genuine human behaviors it mimics. The fifth behavior is the one that arrives when the previous four have not been sufficient to prevent the accountability conversation from occurring. When you are standing in the conversation with enough clarity and enough steadiness that the preemptive strike did not redirect you, the performed vulnerability did not soften you, the reality re-anchoring did not introduce enough doubt to delay you, and the social restructuring did not tilt the available support sufficiently to make continuing this accountability conversation feel too costly. When all four of those fail, the narcissist arrives at the fifth behavior, which is the most direct and most specifically calculated of the sequence. It is the conditional pseudo-accountability, the performance of accountability that is so precisely calibrated to contain exactly enough acknowledgement to function as accountability, without the actual accountability being extended. The conditional pseudo-accountability sounds, on its surface, like what genuine accountability sounds like. It includes the words that genuine accountability includes: acknowledgement that something happened, some reference to the impact it had, some expression of the wish that it had been different. But it contains structural elements that genuine accountability does not contain, and that transform it from a genuine reckoning into a sophisticated threat management tool. The first structural element is the condition, the implicit or explicit linking of the acknowledgement to something the person who was harmed did or is doing, that contextualizes the narcissist's behavior as a response rather than a choice. I should not have done that, but you know how I get when you push me like that. I understand that hurt you, but this would not have happened if you had not been so relentless about the issue. The acknowledgement is present. The responsibility is immediately redistributed. The second structural element is the incompleteness, the acknowledgement that names enough of what happened to seem genuine without naming the full extent of what happened. That acknowledges the surface of the harm without acknowledging its depth or its pattern or the specific damage it produced in the person who received it. And the third structural element is the implicit closing, the quality that the pseudo accountability has of being a statement rather than an opening, of presenting itself as the conclusion of the accountability conversation rather than the beginning of it, of implying that the acknowledgement offered is sufficient and that the conversation should now naturally progress toward the person who was harmed receiving the acknowledgement and responding with the movement toward resolution that the narcissist threat management system needs to achieve. The sixth and final behavior in this sequence, the one that arrives when all 5 of the preceding behaviors have either been deployed or been unavailable, and the threat of genuine accountability is at its most acute, is the one that is simultaneously the most extreme and the most revealing. It is the complete reversal of reality, not the subtle, sophisticated re-anchoring of earlier in the sequence, but the full, direct, explicit assertion that what happened did not happen, that the harm was not caused, that the memory the harmed person has of the event is either false or so significantly distorted by their own psychology that it cannot be trusted as an account of what actually occurred. This complete reversal is different from the earlier stages of the sequence, not just in its explicitness, but in what it reveals about the state of the narcissist threat management system at the moment it is deployed. The earlier behaviors are the actions of a threat management system that still has options, that believes the threat can be managed through one of the available tools without requiring the most extreme response. The complete reversal is the action of a threat management system that has run out of options, that has reached the point where the accountability can no longer be prevented by the sophisticated maneuvering of the earlier stages, and where the only remaining option is the direct, explicit denial of the reality that the accountability is based on, and the reaching for this most extreme option in the moment when all the more sophisticated options have been exhausted, is perhaps the most completely revealing behavior in the entire sequence, because it shows you exactly what the entire sequence was organized around preventing, not the harm done, not the conversation about the harm, the specific, devastating, unmanageable consequence of you arriving at a fully clear, fully grounded, fully unshakable understanding of what actually happened and of your own right to that understanding, and of what it means for the relationship and for the level of access to your life that the person who produced the entire sequence is appropriate to continue to have. That understanding, yours, arrived at through everything the sequence tried to prevent, is what the narcissist's guilt knowledge produces when it is followed all the way through to its most honest conclusion. Not their accountability, yours. Your clarity about what happened, your grounded, unshakable, sequence-surviving certainty about what was real and what was done and what it means. That clarity is the thing the entire sequence was designed to prevent, and the fact that you now have it, having watched the sequence and read it for what it actually was, rather than for what each individual behavior presented itself as, means the sequence failed, which means the threat was never successfully managed, which means the only thing left is the truth. And the truth, in the presence of someone who can now read it clearly, is the most complete accountability available, not because the narcissist offered it, because you arrived at it yourself. And your arrival is something no sequence, however sophisticated, can undo.